Thank you all for coming today to the Mixed Methods webinar series brought to you in part by the MIRA Mixed Methods International Institute or International Research Association, as well as the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. So David Feldon is a professor of instructional technology and learning sciences at Utah State University. His research examines the development of expertise in STEM disciplines as it contributes to effective and innovative problem solving, as well as the quality of instruction. Recent examples of his mixed methods research, published in the American Journal of Educational Research, American Behavioral Scientists, and the Journal of Learning Sciences. Dr. Feldon earned his PhD in educational psychology and his master's in instructional technology from the University of Southern California. Dr. Feldon, we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come. This is actually my first ever webcast, either giving or receiving. So kicking and screaming, I'm making my way into the 20th century. But wanted to talk about the notion of ideographic quality and how to preserve it in mixed methodological analysis. So take a moment before we kind of dive in and talk about the Johnson and Onwe-Bouzy's distinction between mixed methods and mixed models. And so the differentiation that they establish is that mixed methods involves an independent quantitative and an independent quantitative facet that then get integrated, typically in the discussion section of a study. In contrast, mixed models involves mixing between quantitative and qualitative at the level of data collection and data analysis, which provides a little bit more of a philosophical challenge. And so one of the ways that I conceptualize it, I do a lot of work in STEM education, is actually this graphic that's on the slide from, which is a very common piece of science curriculum at the elementary school level when they talk about the differences between mixtures and compounds. So in chemistry, we talk and in physical sciences, we talk about two different elements that might be mixed together in that they're all in the same place, or we might talk about them when they bond and form something new. So if we imagine that element X is qualitative and element Y is quantitative data and analyses, we might think of the Johnson and Onwe-Bouzy mixed methods distinction as being a mixture, where we have both quantitative and qualitative elements. They're both present. They inform one another, but they don't directly interact at a logical level in the analysis. In contrast, mixed models might map onto to something more like a molecule, to a compound, where there is some direct interaction between the two, where they are fundamentally a new logical notion. And so the premise from which I work is that mixed models require a much broader conceptual framework or philosophical framework that allows the treatment of quantitative and qualitative data as like kinds. In essence, we have to find a common denominator that allows us to a little bit more fluidly move back and forth between the quantitative and qualitative elements within this mixed models construct. And by the way, as I'm talking, if there are issues or questions that come up, don't hesitate to throw a comment into the chat window. As people are from all over with very different backgrounds, I definitely want to make sure that it's hitting all the relevant points for everybody who took the time to join us. So within this mixed models perspective, I actually find it very useful to move beyond quantitative and qualitative labels. because fundamentally, when we talk about quantitative, we're talking about numbers, and qualitative, we're talking about words or experiences or things that are social or linguistic in nature. But we can do all kinds of things to data that are much more in line with the conceptual perspective we bring, independent of whether they are strictly quantitative or qualitative. And so, the distinction that I tend to work with is the distinction between nomothetic and ideographic. With the nomothetic framework, with a nomothetic framework being more aligned with quantitative approaches. The assumption is that there is the meaning is derived from the data by identifying a system of laws in the sense that the natural sciences use laws. In contrast, ideographic perspectives value or heighten the perspectival nature of individual experience, the qualia. And so the value here is that many researchers deal with both quantitative and qualitative data on a regular basis, but they typically locate either in a nomothetic or in an ideographic camp. So, for example, in a nomothetic camp, it might be that we spend a lot of time counting words or counting the frequencies of certain kinds of responses, which deals with qualitative data, but not in sort of the rich, thick description way that somebody who identifies typically as a qualitative researcher might feel is a true understanding of the data. So the major focus of the talk today is that we want to look at mixed methods or mixed models as a way of avoiding stripping ideographic data of its perspectival nature. Because to do so reduces the potential value that methodological mixing can offer. In short, we want to avoid doing violence to our data. That if we're collecting ideographic data, if we're collecting rich, thick descriptive qualitative data, it in some ways undermines the value that such data has if we strip it down to something that's simply numeric and doesn't necessarily retain the value that such rich data can bring to a study. So, and it's not to say that this notion of doing violence to data or stripping the underlying properties out of the data in the process of mixing methods only applies to qualitative data. So I actually thought it might be interesting to start with a nomothetic illustration. So when we approach research in a strictly quantitative, traditional experimental kind of way, we always start with a theoretical framework. Right? We start with very fundamental questions about the nature of the phenomenon of interest. Are the phenomena that we're interested in best represented as categories or as continuous data or multidimensional data? We conceptualize what the mechanisms are that the theory specifies, and what are the best methodological tools to engage to capture that and to really be able to tease it out. So an example of where these things can emerge as potentially problematic or challenging is when we look at the notion of what the theory dictates the notion of a phenomenon is in comparison to the methodological strategies that we use. So in the field of educational psychology, there's a long-standing discussion about the notion of goal orientation, where people who are performance goal oriented are largely driven by the opportunity to demonstrate competence, demonstrate proficiency, demonstrate excellence in a public sphere. So they're driven by the opportunity to get the good grade, the opportunity to shine in front of peers, and so on. In contrast, somebody with a mastery goal orientation is somebody who's really driven by the opportunity to learn rather than the recognition that they might receive for their achievement. So when that theory really came to the fore. It was originally conceptualized as a categorical difference. People were either performance goal oriented or they were mastery goal oriented. And so we'd expect the distribution to look like this. We have people that are in one category, people that are in another, and really nobody that's a borderline case. And so in with this kind of a model, if we said, okay, well, how do we want to analyze this? How do we want to study it? How do we want to look for change? We might do something like a chi-square or a one-sided z-test and look and see if people recategorize as an outcome of some intervention from performance to mastery or mastery to performance. But as that conversation went forward, people decided that actually maybe it wasn't that they were distinct categories. Maybe it's that there was a continuum with extreme performance at one end and extreme mastery at the other, and more people that were probably more closely clustered into the middle in a natural distribution. And so then the statistical tools that we'd want to use would be things like a t-test or an ANOVA or regression, things that involve that kind of conceptualization of the phenomenon. And to try to analyze the same data or the same phenomena involving the same people using a chi-square or a one-sided z-test wouldn't be appropriate because the conceptualization of what the data were and what the phenomenon represented were fundamentally different. And now, as that conversation has continued to move forward, people have actually settled on the notion that it's a multidimensional type of phenomenon, where in fact you can have in a not mutually exclusive way both some performance goal orientation and some mastery orientation. And so the notion of how we might analyze those data again changes into a multi-dimensional framework. So neither a chi-square nor a linear regression would necessarily be appropriate. So again, the point of this is really to kind of focus on these very fundamental underlying notions of what we think the phenomena are. So if we're working in a quantitative or a nomothetic frame, we think of the data as indicators of underlying rules that are universal. If we're working with an ideographic frame, where we are conceptualizing the underlying phenomena as inherently embedded in individual and social and contextual influences that operate according to a fundamentally different way of viewing the world. So it then becomes important to treat the data accordingly. So as an illustration of what doing violence to data might look like for a qualitative or an ideographic approach. So this is Shakespeare's 24th sonnet, something that is often considered to be one of his very best. And there are many ways to analyze this. We have a lot of different frames within qualitative research. And I'm going to show you one way of doing it that represents a mixed method rather than a mixed model approach. So I'll do you all the favor of not reading the sonnet to you, but if you want to take a look at it for just a moment, I'll advance the slide, and you can see the what happens when we take a set of qualitative data that are imbued with context and with connections to personal meaning, and we just decide to quantify it. So this is a word cloud that's driven by frequency of terms. And I would suggest that even though this is a mixed method analysis of the sonnet, that perhaps it doesn't really tell us a whole lot that's very meaningful, because it takes to the extreme this notion that we are stripping away something that's fundamentally important to the text that served as the data. Let's see. Okay. So question came of what research paradigms influence my nomothetic or ideographic perspectives. So nomothetic and ideographic, my goal in using them is not actually to tie them to specific paradigms, but rather to present a classification scheme that is at the meta level, but not tied as much to the form of the data themselves. So, again, sort of my critique of classifying things as quantitative or qualitative is that those are labels that describe types of data, but they aren't necessarily labels that describe ways of thinking about or analyzing the data. Does that clarify? Okay, wonderful. So, one of the approaches, and this now gets directly into this notion of research paradigm, one of the uh, approaches that I've found recently to be very promising for moving in this direction, for trying to engage in a mixed, thoughtfully and meaningfully in a mixed models research strategy where we're preserving the ideographic nature of the qualitative data, but still able to do very interesting and robust things from the nomothetic or the quantitative side is phenomenography. And phenomenography, I think, is promising as an orientation for this because it engages both questions of reality, nomothetic reality, as well as questions of individuals' conceptions of reality, which is to say the ideographic aspects, and it positions them really as complementary targets of inquiry. So they inherently go together as part of understanding. Uh, as part of understanding reality. So phenomenography's positionality is very consistent with Maxwell's work in critical realism. This critical realist perspective that there is a single sort of ultimate underlying reality with physical events that take place independent of any one individual's perceptions of it. But at the same time, the way that individuals perceive and interpret their interactions with reality hold equivalent ontological status, which is to say that people's conceptions or their impressions of their interactions with the world are every bit as real as the actions of the world itself. And so this, and so to look at the illustration here for just a moment, this is sort of a representation of a dualist perspective, where on the one hand we have things in the outside world, like the frying pan with the egg in it that's on the stove, and then we also have an individual perspective of it that's something that's happening inside the mind and is fundamentally unique to an individual in some ways. Um, and so, to this extent, being compatible with critical realism and engaging both individual conceptions and physical or uh, nomothetic phenomena uh, as holding an equivalent ontological status, it incorporates some aspects of philosophical pragmatism, of Deweyan pragmatism, which of course is often cited as one of the ways of grounding mixed methods approach. Which is basically taking a non-dualist stance by saying that both the external world and the experienced world exist, and they have relations between them, but that we don't actually hold them separate; that they're considered a broader part of a single ontological real basis. And so that is helpful in terms of moving past this sort of strict nomothetic and ideographic divide uh, because it puts them both on the same ontological playing field. We no longer have a physical world that can never interact with a mental world and vice versa. So in this framework of phenomenology or of phenomenography, excuse me, the primary area of emphasis is something called a conception, and it's basically a mechanism for understanding individuals' personal framing of knowledge and events. It's different from the way that phenomenology treats these things, because under a phenomenological framework, uh, people's individual experiences of something that happens are not separable from the phenomena themselves. In essence, everybody has their own individual lived reality, and we don't really talk in a phenomenological sense about uh, about reality other than through the individual's perspective. So, from an analytic stance, the perception of the event or the understanding of the event and the event itself are identical. Phenomenography doesn't take this leap. It keeps conceptions as legitimate, but not exclusive of a more nomothetic framing. So an individual's conception, their sense making of an external event, uh, has a number of structural relationships, both to other conceptions and to external physical and social factors. So one, if you're familiar with schema theory, you can think of conceptions as being in some ways like schemas, in that the conceptions or the personalized knowledge that you have about various things can inform one another and interact, interrelate, and they can evolve over time. Um, but they also have a structural relation to physical factors, which is to say that we don't think that conceptions show up uh, conceptions of a physical event show up without an underlying physical event. So hallucinations kind of get excluded from conceptions. Likewise, there are anchored connections to social factors, which is to say that individuals' conceptions or their perspectives and experiences of a given event are very much shaped by their relative empowerment, their identity, cultural and linguistic factors, all of the things that tend to get a lot of focus under a phenomenological framework or a critical theory framework also have room to be incorporated here in terms of establishing a robust situating of individuals' conceptions in relation to not just other conceptions that they hold, but external factors that are going to shape them. So conceptions conceptions can be held that don't inherently agree with one another. There's no underlying assumption of full compatibility. So people are able to make sense of things in two different ways, or to change the way in which they make sense of something. So people are able to engage multiple lenses simultaneously. Um, Likewise, conceptions can evolve over time, which in part has an emphasis on either shifting what features or what aspects of a given event or interaction are most important or most meaningful, as well as being able to differentiate features and make them more meaningful. So imagine you have a student in a course, and at the beginning they're completely overwhelmed and not really able to follow the content. That might be the class that they think of as having the professor who wears nice clothes or has a good hairstyle, and that's sort of what's preeminent in their mind when they think about the course, because the content may be really beyond their ability to engage with. But as the course moves forward and they're able to differentiate salient features and make more sense of it, their conception of their course experience might shift to looking at particular aspects of the content. So it has a direct connection to learning from experience in both a knowledge focused and a social way. And so one of the things that is absolutely essential for phenomenography as being a foundation for mixed methodological or mixed model research is that, in contrast to phenomenology, phenomenography holds that there can be a tremendously large range of conceptions across individuals, but it's a finite range. So in one of the underlying assumptions in phenomenology is that there's an infinite possible number of ways to see and shape and make sense of the world around you. And so there is really no way uh, to position any generalizable argument because every individual's experiences are to some extent isolate from every other's in terms of their internal sense making. Phenomenography says there can be a tremendous range, there can be a huge amount of variance in terms of people's conceptions and how they make sense of the world, but that ultimately it's non-infinite. And so once it's finite, then we have an ability to talk meaningfully about something like sampling and starting to move into some of the more ideographic forms of talking about rules and larger shared realities and the principles that govern that reality um, without restricting the possible representation of individuals' meaning making or the ideographic component. So with this finite number of conceptions for any given phenomenon, with that assumption, there are a few corollaries. The first corollary is that you can draw a random sample from a population in a way that permits meaningful arguments about representativeness and generalizability. And the second corollary is that we can posit a natural distribution. Now, it doesn't inherently mean it's a normal distribution, it doesn't mean it's a bell curve, but that any number of distribution models might be applicable to understanding the phenomenon. And so it allows us to do a couple of things that are somewhat unique in crossing the nomothetic ideographic divide. So the first is that new research can build from an a priori framework of conceptions within a reasonably similar context, which is to say that under, say, a phenomenological standpoint, you wouldn't take prior research that had been done and had identified specific themes as a um, as a sound and inherently valid starting place. It might inform your initial perspective, but you wouldn't assume that just because themes were found in some previous research that they would be relevant for the individuals that you're engaging with in terms of collecting data. But if we assert that there's a finite range, if any given study that's published has a suitable range of representation in it, then you're actually positioned to say, you know what, we know that these things exist. They exist in kind of a real way. And knowing that they're there tells us something about the distribution, even if it's not complete. So the second thing that allows us to do is it allows us to actually directly test hypotheses in an ideographic sense. And so we can engage the full panoply of qualitative methods of research in terms of interview and observation and focus groups and case studies and really maximize the richness that comes in the qualitative tradition for trying to understand people's perspectives and their meaning making. But we can actually make a priori hypotheses about what those might look like, what kind of frequency they may have, without fundamentally stripping away the perspectival nature of it, because again, we're dealing with this underlying assumption that that there is not an infinite range. And given that there's not an infinite range, it means that we can deduce some meaningful knowledge about the world from a sampling strategy that tells us something beyond just the sample itself. And so this allows us to engage research questions that can explore things like characterizing the conceptions that people hold, and this is very typical of many different forms of qualitative or ideographic research. We can look at the relative distributions of different conceptions, again, because it's a non-infinite range. And we can also look at features of the environment that might systematically influence both the conceptions that people hold and the distribution of those conceptions within a given population. It also allows us to engage issues of validity, even moving across the nomothetic and ideographic divide. So it gives us an opportunity to evaluate the validity of nomothetic claims by looking at the diversity of ideographic perspectives that are represented. So that is to say, instead of simply finding a significant p-value and a reasonable effect size and moving on, we can ask deeper questions about whether or not the full range of conceptions was really represented. If variance in people's ideographic views of the world are infinite, we can't ask that because there's no way to ever get there. Given that we make this assumption of a finite range of conceptions, we can now query the strength of claims for nomothetic studies on the basis of its underlying ideographic thoroughness, right? So did the sampling reach saturation in terms of emergent conceptions would be a question that we could now ask, even of a very sort of traditional nomothetic type of study design. Likewise, it also puts us in the position of when we do find conflict, when we see differing conceptions or understandings of the underlying phenomenon, neither one is inherently privileged above the other. So in a lot of nomothetic work, if there is a strong majority of participants who view something a certain way, that's assumed, that's treated as if it's the quote unquote correct way, and the people in the extreme minority are considered to be outliers or variants, and they're typically disregarded from the analysis. With a phenomenographic framework, that's not a legitimate move because it establishes the conceptions are equally real to the underlying physical events. So we're able to critique a traditional quantitative or nomothetic study on the basis of whether or not it's treating all conceptions as having equivalent ontological and epistemological status. So there are a couple of different examples from the literature that I'm going to highlight, and after we go through those, I'll wrap up with a few closing thoughts, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So Trigwell and Prosser published a number of studies in the 90s and the 2000s where they used a phenomenographic framework. And one of the things that I actually find from a methodological perspective kind of interesting is they did a tremendous amount of qualitative work under this phenomenographic framework, and then they went on to take the conceptions they identified and build quantitative instruments with them, but they virtually never published the qualitative and the quantitative pieces in the same place. So they kept the dissemination of the work fairly mono method, even though the larger project inherently was mixing models. So they did what Creswell would describe as a sequential exploratory study. They started with interviews of 24 first-year faculty members in the sciences, and they wanted to understand the conceptions that were held in terms of intentions that these faculty members held for student learning, as well as strategies that they engaged. And through the process of their qualitative analyses, their ideographic analyses, they identified three major themes in terms of strategy and two conceptions and a relationship between them. And so the strategies were that there were some people who were much more teacher focused, some who were much more student focused, and some who were much more focused on the interaction between student and teacher. And then the two dominant conceptions that they identified, one was a focus on information transmission and the other on facilitating conceptual change. And so as they worked through these data, which were drawn from multiple interviews with participants, quite over a longer period of time, they ended up developing a survey that had closed-ended items, so Likert scale type items, based on the conceptions they found. So they started with 104 statements that were drawn from the corpus of the 24 participants. They retained 49 of them, and they grouped them into 5 subscale groupings preliminarily, 3 that were focused on instructor strategies and 2 that were focused on conceptions. They examined face validity issues with 11 additional faculty and settled on 39 different items. They then gave it out to a larger group, 58 instructors, and they did and so they've moved from very traditional qualitative work to very traditional quantitative work. Now they're moving into principal components analysis and correlation analyses to look at the sort of the underlying factor structure of these different items. And so they find that that there are these five subscales, and which were drawn from the qualitative themes. But through the correlation analysis, they discovered a relation between student-teacher interaction um, and the other items, to where they ended up reclassifying it, which was different than the qualitative analysis. So again, from a phenomenographic frame, in a traditional phenomenological frame or a traditional qualitative frame, you would never change the observed relations among themes because it's always inductive. You're limited solely by the people that you talk to. You don't generalize beyond. But they're trying to develop an instrument that is generalizable in this sort of larger nomothetic reality. And so they uncovered a statistical relationship between two conceptions that weren't identified during the qualitative phase, and so they made some adjustments on that basis. So I think it's a nice illustration of the ability to move back and forth between quantitative and qualitative while not getting in trouble in terms of violating underlying ontological or epistemological assumptions about the data. And so ultimately they do have this larger convergence of the structure of conceptions through both their qualitative and their quantitative work. And so the second example that I wanted to share is actually a study of mine that I engaged with colleagues. We published a couple of years ago in the American Educational Research Journal. And so in the study, we were looking at graduate students in STEM disciplines and their faculty mentors, and trying to understand the development of their research skills. And so we used a concurrent triangulation design. We individually interviewed 81 different graduate students in various STEM disciplines. Separately, we interviewed their advisors. And what we asked the students, and then separately asked the advisors, is what are your strengths and weaknesses as a researcher? So for the students, they said these are the things I'm really good at. These are the things I'm not so good at. We asked their advisors. Their advisors also said, oh, that student has these strengths and has these weaknesses. And what we found from these intact mentor-mentee pairs is that actually only about 23% of them even mentioned the same skills. And that was quite a surprise to us, because we figured that they'd be, as a mentor and a mentee, they'd probably be focusing on the same kinds of areas in terms of working with students' development. But we found that they really just departed from one another. And what was even further surprising was that when we looked at the instances when they did mention the same skill, almost half the time the student and the faculty member disagreed about whether it was a strength or a weakness. So here, this is a great sort of illustration of the ways in which conceptions are influenced by individuals' perspectives. So from the ways in which students were making sense of their world and their experiences, they saw things as being strengths that their advisor from this other perspective saw as being an area of weakness. The other thing we did was we elicited written research proposals from all of these students, and then recruited raters who were trained within each of their respective disciplines to use a rubric to score the quality of the research proposal. And so after we had this rubric applied to scoring this performance-based assessment, we then went back and matched the identified strengths and weaknesses from the interviews to the criteria that were in the rubric, and that gave us then an opportunity to triangulate between the student perspective, the faculty perspective, and the score on the rubric. What we found is that none of the three predicted either of the others. So student perspectives did not predict faculty perspectives or vice versa, and neither students nor faculty, for the most part, were able to, their assessments did not predict the rubric score. And so again, so here's an opportunity for a strength of phenomenography in that we weren't in a position of needing to assert that one form of data or another were more ontologically real. So in a traditional nomothetic or quantitative frame, we might say, well, we know that self-reports are flawed, and we have blind rating using a tool, so we're going to use the rubric score as the dominant source of data and draw our conclusions that way. But phenomenography allows us to position these three different conceptions, these three different sources of conceptions, as being equivalently real, and linking these patterns to structural positionalities, where we can start to talk about the perspective of the student, the perspective of the faculty member, and the perspective of a quantitative instrument. And so the emphasis in terms of our conclusions from the study was that none of these were actually wrong in relation to another. So we didn't have an objective and a subjective measure where one had sort of ontological or epistemological primacy. But the other is that it was an opportunity to recognize that we needed to understand the meaning of these divergent perspectives in a context of practice, and that would apply to something like looking at a letter of recommendation or some other kind of recommendation for an award or something, where we'd want to get a sense of what a particular student candidate's qualifications were, but understanding that different perspectives might show up in different ways. And so we couldn't simply assume, oh, the faculty member knows best because they're the expert and in the supervisory position. We couldn't assume the student knew best because they were talking about their own experiences and their own work, and we couldn't assume that the blind rating instrument knew best because it wasn't either of those. So to wrap up, in this focus on phenomenography as a way to preserve the ideographic aspects of data, and to allow us to bring in nomothetic research strategies in conjunction. Right? We know that pragmatism, as a philosophical pragmatism, as a foundation for mixed methods, has gained, according to Biesta, has gained us some ground in that we are no longer crippled by unhelpful epistemological dichotomies, right? So we no longer have this incommensurability hypothesis that really locks us into either nomothetic or ideographic, which is to say either quantitative or qualitative. But pragmatism doesn't actually provide the philosophical foundation that would allow us to move forward with mixed methods research. In essence, it gets rid of the dichotomy, the incommensurability hypothesis, but it doesn't actually give us an answer in terms of how we can meaningfully integrate ideographic data and nomothetic data in a way that doesn't do violence or violate the full richness of either one. So phenomenography, from my perspective, serves as a viable and unified framework that allows us to engage in a number of different strategies, discourse and hermeneutics, and as well as experimental research methods. And its flexibility and its epistemological assumptions allow us to engage in very nuanced and complex methodological thinking in terms of taking mixed model strategies, where we can navigate back and forth between an ideographic, inherently perspectival notion of reality and a rule-driven, law-driven independent reality that can be spoken about meaningfully in terms of generalizability and representativeness. And so it provides us this framework to move forward, where we aren't forced to keep quantitative and qualitative evidence separately and synthesize it only in discussion, but rather can move forward in a a strong philosophical underpinning that allows us to mix in a way that gives us a fully integrated notion of both ideographic and nomothetic perspectives. And so a lot of the work that's driven this talk we published in a recent special issue on mixed methodology in American Behavioral Scientist, and the link that's up on the slide right now will take you to a full PDF copy of that, because I know that not everybody has easy access to that particular journal. But that kind of concludes my comments, and I definitely would welcome any questions or thoughts as we move forward. It's always an interesting experience to try to give a talk without being able to see anyone's faces. So I'm hoping that you're all fully gripped and engaged by these ideas. But I'm very excited to hear your thoughts and to clarify or elaborate if any of you have any questions.
That was great. Thank you very much, David. So we will now open the floor to questions. So if you do have a microphone, you can raise your hand and you can let us know your name and where you're from, and you can ask your question. If you don't have a microphone, you can write your question below in the chat area, and that'll get read out and you'll get your answer. Okay, we've got some people writing, so that's good. Yeah, is this Duet?
Yes, David speaking this side, David. Can I ask my question?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Can I go ahead? Thank you, David. Thank you for the presentation. Just referring to your last conclusion of your research, that article which you were one of the main author there. You come to the conclusion that none of the three is actually singularly correct. Is that correct? Is that what you said?
Yes, that they all hold equivalent ontological status. No one is no more real than the others.
Is there a possibility that by integrating the three, you could come to a total different phenomenon?
Yes. That possibility certainly does exist, and the larger research project that we drew that from was rather multifaceted, so we didn't necessarily have as much depth on that particular question as we might have liked to be able to engage that. But offhand, I don't know what such a unified phenomenon might be. But absolutely, it is possible that the apparently contradictory data elicited from the three different positions might be reflective of some underlying system.
Yes, yeah. My argument is just that it could be. Looks like to me, it could be if you have contradictory. It's not contradictory per se, but it needs to be reinterpreted for a new reality.
Yes. On the one hand, I think that there's a lot of value there in trying to conceptualize and understanding what that new reality is. On the other hand, certainly from a phenomenographic framework, reality can simply be that you're going to have irreconcilable differences in conceptions of the same event.
Yeah, I take that point. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we've got a question from Marcy Antonio. Thank you, Dr. Feldon. Can you go through a bit of the process you went through in your study on how you determine the concepts to include in your analysis?
Sure. So and so that was that approach was interview driven, iterative analysis. It was a very similar to sort of a grounded theory approach in terms of doing multiple iterations of coding through the corpus of interviews, and identifying codes and reclassifying and accreting into themes. And so there were some themes that emerged that were very concrete. So, statistical analysis or generating appropriate review of the literature, or so on. But there were other things that emerged that were much less tangible in that way. Things like curiosity, or being highly organized, or being passionate about the work. These sorts of things. And so we looked for agreement we looked for the occurrence of codes and themes within students and within faculty in terms of the interviews. And then when we did the crossed analysis with the rubric, then we were focusing only on the skills that could be clearly mapped to the rubric as well. Does that help? Be a little higher level than what you expected.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Yes, thanks, perfect. Okay, so if anyone else has any other questions, we do still have a few minutes left. So again, you can raise your hand and I can give you the microphone, or you can just type your questions below. Okay, in that case, if there aren't any more questions, I don't see any more hands up. Then we'll go with that today. Dr. Feldon, thank you very much for your presentation. Did you have any closing words before we end the session?
No, only thanks very much to everybody who took the time to log on. I hope that you found it worthwhile and interesting. I'm very happy to chat with anybody outside of this platform if there's something that might be of interest. I definitely encourage you to take a look at the paper, which gives you a chance to kind of go through at your own pace a little bit, and might provide some more thorough discussion of some pieces that I might have glossed over a little bit in this platform. But I'm really happy to see everybody come out, and I thank you very much for your time.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this presentation, and we hope to see you next month. Take care and have a great afternoon.